It's my real pleasure to introduce Cheryl Corcoran. She will be presenting here some of the work she's been doing over the years in patients at risk for psychosis, as well as patients with psychosis. It's also been a great pleasure for me to work with her over so many years as well. Cheryl did her MD in Harvard, and then she went to all the Ivy schools you can think of, Yale, Columbia. She worked in all of them. And she's now associate professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine in New York City. And she leads the high-risk program there as well. And it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Romina, for that very nice introduction. Thank you, Kristen, for organizing. Also, Lena and Albon, my old friends and colleagues. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It sounds like you have a really good program here in terms of youth prevention. That's something that's dear to my heart. I've been doing clinical high-risk research in schizophrenia since the last millennium. We're trying to figure out how to prevent the onset of psychosis. We've not been successful yet, but we're trying to figure it out. So I have a grant. I had a grant with Romina and also colleagues in Australia, Melbourne, Australia, Barnaby Nelson, where we looked at language across stages of schizophrenia. And now I have a new grant, yay, for doing audio and video recording to look at face expression and acoustics and all of this all together. So I don't have a lot of time to cover all of this, so it will be mostly a survey. A lot of it my own work, but I'll do a shout out to Lena and Alban. So my understanding is that not everybody is an expert in schizophrenia. Oh, how do I? It's not moving. I'm sorry. Oh, just there. I'm sorry. Okay, so in psychiatry, what do we know about any kind of diagnosis? All we know is from looking at people and what they tell us. We read medical records, but that's just somebody else's language, a clinician describing an encounter. So language, behavior, that's really what we have. We don't have any biomarkers to make any kind of diagnoses in psychiatry yet. They're all syndromes. And the impairment really is related to disturbances in behavior and in thinking. So Steven Pinker had said language is a window into the mind. As I mentioned, it's the primary source of data for diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. And I understand you're all mostly clinicians, so I'll give you a shout out that to look at language and behavior just simply by recording it and analyzing it. The field that I'm working in, as I'll tell you in a little bit, came out of doing qualitative research. So I think it's inexpensive and it's exciting and it's something that's accessible even if you don't have a lot of money. Very easy to record. All you need is a smartphone. Actually, smartphones have the best microphones and cameras. And so I've been a psychosis researcher for a while, and in psychosis, there are definitely disturbances in language and communication. So I put this up. It's redundant maybe for some of you, but just to remind you what's entailed in schizophrenia, there are the positive symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, but also disorganized thought and communication, people going off track and being concrete. The concreteness actually goes under the negative symptoms of alogia. And there are a lot of cognitive deficits in schizophrenia, about 1 standard deviation below the norm, processing speed, verbal memory, verbal fluency. You can imagine these may all influence language. And actually, I put in blue what's related to language. I could have also put depression and suicidal ideation. That's related a little more to content, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later as well. So I put this slide in for all of you because you are trying to prevent disorders in youth, and adults used to be children, right? And so the antecedents of all psychiatric diagnoses are in childhood and adolescence, and that's particularly true for schizophrenia. So there were years ago very well done, careful studies of the phenomenology of schizophrenia as it evolved over time. Some of these were cohort studies where they followed a whole population of children. If you compare the people who developed schizophrenia with those who didn't, as toddlers, they had delays in walking and talking, speech problems at the ages of 4 to 6. And then in the teen years is when you have a sort of an acceleration of symptoms. So those of us who have been doing prodromal or clinical high-risk research, as I've been doing for the past 20 years, this is a very good time to try to find and study people who may be at risk for schizophrenia, because the risk is imminent within a few years. And you get this functional decline, academic, social withdrawal, and emergence of psychotic-like symptoms. So you have the form fruste of psychosis. So people have unusual thought content. They may be a little suspicious. They may hear their name in the wind. But this is the period of time that we focus on in trying to find people who are truly at risk for schizophrenia. So language production in psychosis since the 1970s, Nancy Andreasen realized how important this was. I actually gave a talk in Iowa and I had all these slides by Andreasen, and they thought I had put it in because I was in Iowa, where she's from. But she's really actually very seminal in studies of language in psychosis and schizophrenia. And she conceived the language disturbance as being a sort of positive thought disorder, being tangential, derailing, going off track. What we've conceptualized in others as a decrease in coherence as people speak. We've modeled that with natural language processing. I'll get to that. The other sort of her domain in her heuristic is negative thought disorder. So that's not really going off track. That's not really having much to say. Poverty of speech, poverty of content, much less complexity. Now, what Andreasen had done actually in the 70s, which we've adhered to, but we could talk in the Q&A about this, is to really have an open-ended interview where patients are invited to talk without interruption. So very unstructured. You know, sometimes it hurts me with grant applications. People say it's not structured, but we think that really we have to, it doesn't matter what people are talking about. We want to give them the opportunity to go off track, because if you structure the conversation, you actually kind of interfere with the symptom you're trying to study. By structuring the conversation. And Nancy Andreasen had done this, and she said, the goal is to observe a patient's speech and language behavior without complicated experimental procedures. Just let people talk. And without any attempt to characterize the underlying cognitive processes. So no like cognitive tasks, just let people talk. And then she developed a scale, and it was a clinical rating scale. And you know, it was the 70s. We didn't have ChatGPT and natural language processing then. And sort of an analogy of this, Natalia Mota, who Lana and Alvin and I know well, who's from Brazil, who's done a lot of really nice work in this area, developed the ideas of speech graphs. And so each one of these nodes is a word. So this is someone with schizophrenia. So you can see it's a very sparse. This is a healthy individual. You know, they talk, they come back to the topic, they go off a little bit, but they come back. Here, schizophrenia, not only is it sparse, but they don't really come back. And then she also, like Nancy Andreasen, studied patients with bipolar disorder, including when they were manic. And I understand that a number of you are studying bipolar as well. So this actually is an area that needs study, so language and bipolar. So I welcome you to do that. And here you can see just what you would expect with bipolar. There's much that they're saying, they're going off tangents, they're coming back, etc. So just to go back to schizophrenia, I'm not a bipolar researcher. Over the years, there have been some studies to see if you could detect changes in the problems with coherence and complexity long before somebody develops a first episode of psychosis. And in fact, you can. So this is work by Diane Gooding. It was in the New York High Risk Project at Columbia that started years and years ago. And they studied the offspring of parents with schizophrenia, affective disorder, or no diagnosis. They followed them for several years. And they had a semi-structured interview of 8 to 10 minutes when they were 10. And then of that group, 23 later developed psychosis. So Diane looked very carefully using Andreassen's scale, thought language communication ratings. And remarkably, the ratings of coherence and complexity in the 10-year-old speech had a higher than 90% accuracy in predicting who would develop psychosis or schizophrenia. That's really remarkable. The positive thought disorder, the going off track, predicted both bipolar and schizophrenia, but that negative thought disorder of decreased complexity was more specific to schizophrenia. I think this is really cool. That you could, in someone so young, granted these are people at familial risk, that it was so highly predictive. In clinical high risk, and I forget my clinical high risk slide. So clinical high risk, I mentioned a little bit about how these individuals have attenuated psychosis. Are you guys familiar with clinical high risk? Yeah. Good. Okay. And I know there's a very good clinical high risk and first episode psychosis program here that I work with Jay Shah as part of the consortium. Were you there, Jay? I didn't think you'd be here today. So Jay, you certainly know about clinical high risk. So this is Carrie Bearden, who is a clinical high risk researcher, and more than a decade ago, she was interested in also saying if language features would be predictive of who develops psychosis. And she did use something structured. It's called Kaplan's story game. And kids hear a story, and then they have to retell it. They answer questions about it. This is manual linguistic analysis. It's very labor intensive, requires a lot of training. So not really scalable. But what she found was that individuals, and this is the blue, the clinical high risk who went on to develop psychosis, had a lot more illogical thinking that's kind of like the positive thought disorder, and more poverty of content. And here are examples of illogical thinking. I went to school because my name is Tom, and here you see poverty of content. So now everybody knows about large language models and ChatGPT. But back in like 2014, 2015, it wasn't such a thing. And I had a colleague, so I want to tell you a few things, not just about this research, but research in general. I was already telling you that just simply get consent and record interactions with patients. You have a data set, you can analyze it. Lena, you've been doing that, right? You have these beautiful data sets. But the other thing with research is to watch for serendipity. So chance favors the prepared. So I was in 2013, 2014, a decade ago, I was doing my clinical high risk research. I had a very promising research coordinator who said, it's very nice that I ask people all these questions and that I do these cognitive tests. But really what I'm interested in is what their experience is. You know, is there a way that I could study that? And I said, sure, you know, write an IRB. It's not too expensive. We'll record it. And we did. And then we did all this qualitative research analysis. And then a colleague of mine doing substance abuse research said, hey, I've been collaborating with these people at IBM to do computational analysis of language. Columbia had this cool thing where people, the same people could come in and under experimental conditions use drugs. So she was working with them. She had people, the same people speak when they used methamphetamine or when they used ecstasy, or I think those were them. And then did this natural language processing analysis. Very cool because it's with an individual. Found that when people were on methamphetamine, they spoke more quickly. surprise, surprise, when they were talking, when they were on ecstasy, they were talking about love and peace. So she said, do you have any transcripts? And I said, yeah. And so, I met these people at IBM who I now still work with a decade later, and they did some analyses. And to look at semantic coherence, I'll show you a slide. We did something that was latent semantic analysis. I'll tell you about that. Latent semantic analysis actually goes back to the 1990s. It was the precursor of all kinds of large language programs now. It's called word embeddings, if you're familiar with that. Now we also use transformers. I'll tell you a little bit. But with this latent semantic analysis, you could see how people would go off track. And then for syntactic complexity, just to go back to Noam Chomsky, and for the older people in the audience, we used to have a chalkboard and we'd see noun, verb, and to do part of speech tagging. And the idea is that this would be more objective than clinical ratings, certainly a lot less time consuming than manual linguistic analysis. And I've been working with Guillermo Cecchi of Argentina, like Ramin is. So this is the idea behind semantic coherence. And so T.K. Landauer was in the 1990s, and you have to actually go back to his original papers because they're beautifully written. So he came up with this idea, a problem to tackle, Plato's problem, which is basically how can people, especially children, be given such little information, and yet with that information sort of generalize and have all this knowledge? How do people generalize? And he modeled this in his 1997 computer. And what he did was he took a large corpus of text and he looked at how often words co-occurred with one another. And then you could determine the semantic similarity among different words. So you see here, for instance, if you had words, and this is a semantic space, so you had huge and tiny, you have these fruits, and you have here parts of the body and colors. If you come with white, where would that go? That would go with the colors, right? And you know that the computer, well, we know it, but the computer knows it only through kind of brute force, looking at lots of associations in a large corpus of text. And so each word, using matrix analysis in a lexicon, can get a vector, and a vector has a direction. And so the cosine is a measure of the angle between vectors. So you could, things that are more similar, the cosine will be closer to 1. The ones that are more different, it will be going more towards 0 and -1. And it's the end of the math. So in terms of vectors, if you have a series of vectors, all the words in a sentence they each have a vector, you can sum them. So your sentence has a vector. And then because language is in real time, one after another, you could see here, this is one sentence, this is the next sentence, this is a third. You could kind of conceptualize, maybe here this person is going off track a little. And so we use that to determine the extent to which patients were going off track. And then this is the sort of grammar tree from Noam Chomsky, and part of speech tagging. With part of speech tagging, you have like noun or verb. It's, a little more probabilistic and complicated, because a lot of words could be a noun or a verb. So you have to look at context. But by doing this kind of tree, this grammar tree, you could look at also at the complexity of speech. How long are the sentences that people speak? Do they use dependent clauses or not? So serendipity, I learned all this about 10 years ago. And so we found, and it was a very small cohort, it was proof of principle. And this was looking at clinical high-risk patients and who developed psychosis or not. And we came up with the machine classifier that had semantic coherence and syntactic measures of complexity, specifically the parts of speech that introduce dependent clauses and the length of the sentence. And Guillermo used, there are many machine learning classifiers. This is a very nice one called convex hull classification. And it's a data set that is determined, it's a space that is determined by all of the data points in a set, kind of shrink wrapped, the smallest space you could have. So what we had found here was, and again, very small, among the 5 people who developed psychosis, they were outside of this space. The 34, 29 who did not were inside. So I'm going to stop there with language, just because I could talk about language. Well, I'll say a little bit. So there's been a lot of work. Is discourse next? Oh, there it is. I'll go back. There's been a lot of work in the field, and actually Lena and Alban both are part of really advancing the field. You know, it's nice, my 2015 paper, my little paper, made a big splash, which was also serendipitous. The head of NIMH quit to do this research, which was really weird. But lots of things have been done. So, you know, my little paper gets quoted a lot, mostly as a foil about how people are doing it better. I'm amused when I get those to review. But it seems like the coherence has some staying power. Complexity people have looked at in other ways as well, the extent to which there are adjectives and adverbs. We've been also looking at metaphor. So we are just finishing up a paper. This is really cool, actually, that's cross-sectional, that shows clinical high risk and psychosis patients compared to healthy individuals use more metaphor. But they're not more bizarre. They just use more metaphor. And it's the extent to which they use metaphor is not related to their symptoms or to their function. It's just a feature of the illness, or, you know, you might say syndrome, right? If it's not. So, you know, that's like an old argument about whether psychosis can lead to creativity. And it's a little complex because, you know, we're not sure if these are just like, you know, aphorisms that they're repeating. So we have to look at it more. So we're looking at metaphor. You can also use, I'm sorry, I don't have slides for this. You could also use natural language processing to see the extent to which people spontaneously speak about something. You could take any clinical rating scale, so not just psychosis, bipolar, depression, anything. And you could take the items. So you have each item in the scale. And then you could see if there's semantic similarity in what people spontaneously speak about with the items on the scale. And we actually just published a paper on that using the IPACE, anomalous self-experiences. And we found that clinical high-risk patients, more than healthy controls and even psychosis patients, have sentences that begin with the letter, you know, with I. They talk about themselves a lot. And a lot of what they talk about map onto these anomalous self-experiences. And we've also done qualitative analysis in the same cohort. So this can be very cool to put qualitative analysis and computational analysis together, because then you have sort of the humans and the computers together. And we're finding, you know, that kind of, with the traditional qualitative research, also disturbances in identity in terms of thematic analysis. It's kind of cool, I think, to put qualitative and and you could do that with anything. You can infer symptoms. You can combine with qualitative research. There's someone who's coming to Mount Sinai from Columbia named Baihan Lin, who's looking at dialogue alignment and the extent to which that predicts therapeutic alliance, which is very cool, right? Because we want to, when we treat people, have a good therapeutic alliance. We have a good sense of that. We could even do clinical ratings if we like. And natural language processing gives us one more tool to try to look at that. I mentioned the mixed methods. I have to give a shout out to Jay and also to Romina, because you've been very much involved in these recent papers, the IPACE paper. And we have also found that among clinical high-risk patients, comparing those with and without suicidal ideation or a history of suicidal behavior, that those who have suicidal ideation or a history of behavior spontaneously, their spontaneous spoken language has more semantic similarity to the word anger. So there's a lot of anger in their speech. So you can look at content. So I don't have so much time, and like I said, I would talk more about my own work. But both Lena and Albin have done really seminal work in looking at the neural mechanisms that underlie this. So you've done sort of white matter, Albin, and connecting that to language and speech, and also medication effects, which is important. And I know, Lena, you have looked at neural correlates, I think mostly of speech graphs. This is a wide open field, and it's burgeoning. The other thing also is that many studies have been done in English. Albin has done them in Dutch, which makes sense since he's from the Netherlands. Natalia Mota, who I spoke about earlier, who does speech graphs, has done her work in Brazil. And so it's this discourse program that Lena has is remarkable, has founded, and now has participation from around the world, and sort of talks now and then. Now you're collecting it, I believe, in several languages. I'm also, as is Jay, part of the Accelerating Medicine's Partnership in Schizophrenia, which is an initiative by the National Institute of Mental Health in the US to I think there are 40 sites worldwide in which we're collecting data on clinical high-risk patients and following them. They get MRI, EEG, they have a smartphone for passive recording, fluid biomarkers, all kinds of questionnaires, but also the collection of audio and video. And so that data set, actually, that gets a small part of it was released recently, but that will be available to everyone as well. In terms of the methods, so I've used this open-ended approach. Sort of the first study was just based on qualitative research, and it seemed to work. But I appreciate that, having someone talk for half an hour in an open-ended way, that's like time, et cetera. So people do capitalize on recording interviews. We're doing that now actually with Alzheimer's and autism. You can imagine. So my own institution, everybody wants to do this, right? So I'm working with autism researchers, Alzheimer's, et cetera. But it's not always easy to have that kind of open-ended interview. And Natalia, I think, uses a solicitation of dream reports, and I know you've put together something, Lena, that has everything in it. But you also have to consider, not just with language. It's very. I'm really sorry I didn't put in these slides. We had a study in which we had from these open-ended interviews language from clinical high-risk patients in Shanghai who spoke Mandarin. And it was cross-sectional. It's not so big. It's in World Psychiatry. And we did both English language, natural language processing analyses of translations of the transcript. This was Guillermo. But there was also a Chinese scientist, of course, bicultural, bilingual, who did Mandarin-based natural language processing. This was kind of cool. The measures of coherence were important in both languages in differentiating the clinical high risk from the healthy individuals. That's one example where it doesn't always translate. I know in Turkish, in the Faroe Islands, there are always language specific things, but also there were features, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mandarin, there were features that came up with the language-based NLP in the same individuals that we wouldn't have been able to capture with the English. So, and then we have to think about ethics as well. I just wanted to mention, how am I doing for time? I want to make sure I get to the face stuff. So when someone speaks and you record it and you transcribe it, you could analyze the transcripts. But you could also analyze the audio recordings. And so there are programs like Pratt from the Netherlands. There's also Open Smile. These are off-the-shelf programs, and you can you need to diarize the speech, you need to separate the speech of different people, but then you can generate variables. I don't know how many of you are familiar with variables in prosody, like jitter and grit, and Mel Sepstrom, which is frequency, but you could do all of that. And we did this. We also looked at pauses in speech. People with schizophrenia have long and irregular pauses. That's pretty much a replicated finding, and we found that in clinical high risk as well. So I'm going to get to faces now. So as I mentioned, we had a grant before, and I know discourse also is moving. It's not just language, it's communication and acoustics and also face expression. So this is a little bit of a pivot, because language, I think, is very cognitive. But the face expression, so in schizophrenia, a lot of people have a flat affect. They don't have much emotional expression. You see this in some clinical high-risk patients as well. Also in schizophrenia, some people have an odd affect. We haven't started to model that yet, but we will. Icahn, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Icahn, he came up with a whole system for measuring the amplitude of face motor activity in different face action units. So I put some of these here. This is the inner brow raiser, brow lowerer. Get rid of that because I think that's the one. So action unit 7 is a lid tightener, and action unit 7 I'm particularly interested in, and a lot of work that's been done in this area in schizophrenia implicates action unit 7 in particular. So why is that important, this lid tightener? So if you've heard of like the Duchenne, you guys may not know this. I did not, and I thought it was really cool. I read a lot of this. Darwin, in addition to studying finches, and also was really, really interested in face expression and how it played a role in natural selection, which I think is really cool. And if you think about it, it would make sense, right, that communication, social communication, even in non-human primates who don't have language, would be important or might play some role in natural selection. He had characterized this as a feature of melancholia, and it's right here. It's the brow lowerer, AU4, and he called this the omega sign. And if you see there is an omega. And I have a really good friend who's suffered from major depression. And when I read this, I'm like, she had that all the time when she would have relapses. And so he characterized this omega sign in depression. And then Duchenne was also around the same time. The Duchenne smile, you guys you've heard about smizing, right, from Tyra Banks. So these are examples of like, this is like a genuine smile, right? It's not just, it's the mouth and the eyes. This is the mouth, not so much the eyes. You could say, well, these are different people, but here you have the same person. You can see how the smile is different. So action unit 7, the work that's been done on that really implicates it as being relevant to social communication. So for instance, they studied the face expression of people who have won some sporting event. And the time that they were really communicating with their eyes was when they got the award. They were happy, but they were also like triumphant. It's just very much involved in social communication. And then here, this is actually from Darwin. And so this guy has a Duchenne smile. He's smiling with his eyes and his mouth. So face expression is motor, right? Mostly, but also limbic. And so it's the anterior, the dorsal cingulate that's very important for face expression. So for face, you get information from the viscera, it goes to the amygdala, the limbic system. That's a supplementary motor. This M3, M4 are very relevant. And it's interesting because there's some division between the upper face and the lower face. So just, I think, characterizing the face expression in schizophrenia and risk states, much like what Lena and Alvin have done, we could also look at the neural mechanisms. We could actually maybe model it a little bit better in non-human primates. And so what's known in schizophrenia and clinical high risk? I told you about the flat facial expression. There's a lot of heterogeneity, right? Not all people with schizophrenia have negative symptoms. Early video coding studies out of UPenn, they were very ambitious. This is before we had all the computational off-the-shelf stuff. They tried to develop it themselves. And just to go back, Icahn traditionally has been measured using just ratings. People are trained, like look at the face and how to rate it. And you could also do electromyogram to actually measure the face activity, but people don't really like that, and you can only look at a few muscles. But now there are programs like Open Face that will just tell you face action units, all off the shelf. So these small pioneering studies that were at UPenn, they had done an emotion expression classifier trained on posed expressions by actors. They found that in schizophrenia, there was a mismatch so they asked people to pose and it didn't match the actor. I mean, it was a nice try, but it was a small cohort and it's not really naturalistic to have people pose. But so now we're doing these automated analyses. And this was kind of serendipity for us. This is my second serendipity slide. So when I had the last grant with Vermina, and also Jay was involved, we were collecting language, right? But we knew that we wanted video. But we spent a good year or two like debating which video setup to get and how would we sync it, synchronize it, et cetera. And then the pandemic happened and everything moved to Zoom. And it's just really easy to record via Zoom. You just press a button and everything is synchronized. The speech is diarized, meaning you could separate the two people who are speaking. Not that it's good that COVID happened, but it was a silver lining for us in terms of research. So we've used HIPAA-approved Zoom. So I'm putting this up here just if you wanted a standard operating procedure, I have it. I mean, I guess probably Lena does too, but we have a whole thing where it's easy to just set it up. You have to like uncheck all the way, Zoom was not developed for the collection of raw data. It was to facilitate communication. So you have to uncheck all the automatic adjustments to get raw data. And then we've been doing this open-ended interview. So just see for time, because I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. We have about 4 minutes. So this just shows the difference. So schizophrenia patients versus healthy controls, have much less action unit 6, action unit 7 around the eyes. We also looked at mean action unit amplitude overall. We found group differences for the schizophrenia patients, not for the clinical high risk because they're very heterogeneous. But being heterogeneous, we could look at correlations with symptoms. This N3 is a measure, a clinical rating of face affect. So we found that was correlated. There is some correlation with social function. And this is Steve Heisig, who is an engineer who's done all of this work. We also found that people with schizophrenia had a decreased repertoire of face expressions. So these are the raw action units, and each of these is like a configuration or a facial expression. And so whenever this shows like when it repeats, you can see there's more of a repertoire in schizophrenia patients than there are in healthy controls. And this too is also related. So we got some ground truth confirmation with clinical ratings. It seems to have some relevance for social function. So now what we're doing is this is just at the beginning, we're doing multimodal analysis. So you see here, basically when you have a conversation in a dyad, you have two people and each one has a time series of behavior. And I just would I recommended Landauer to actually read it. There's beautiful work by Wilson and others about communication. It's really amazing, like a dyadic communication, all the things that go on. You're like planning to say your next thing, you're listening. You have to sort of reflect what the person's saying, but you may have an agenda and there's surprise. And the pauses in a conversation are really a metronome. Outside of schizophrenia, like studies in the lab, if you introduce longer pauses, it derails the whole conversation. It has to start again. So it's very temporal and it's interesting. So this is like a rich data set that you could look at many things. So here's like the speech of the subject and the interviewer. We could look at the pitch. This is when they're talking and not talking. And then we could also align it with the face action units. This might get us at some point to unusual affect because, like if someone's talking about something sad and they're smiling, that's odd. But you need both modalities to determine that. We've also looked at facial mimicry. So we used a proprietary program to look at joy just as a label. There are problems with calling things joy. There are many ways to express joy, et cetera. But what you see here, this is a healthy individual, and the interviewer is in green and the participant is in orange. They're kind of tracking over a longer time frame and also over the shorter time frame. And here is someone with schizophrenia. And not only do they have less facial expression, but the facial expression of the person interviewing them is also more flat. So you can get information about a patient just by looking at the interviewer. And there are analogs of this, studies of prosody in autism, where people with autism can have an unusual prosody, this kind of like uptick at the end. And the people who interview them actually will start to adapt that same uptick. And if you think about like talking to people, the different people that you talk to, some you may speak more slowly, the topic matches, face expression matches, gaze matches. It's very rich to look at these time series. These are some of the ongoing technical issues that we have. There's a little bit of a lag. There are ethical issues. I hope I didn't offend anyone. And so then we're looking, like with language, this has been done to some extent, but for the grant that we have, associations with clinical ratings, what are the sources of variance, test, retest, is it acceptable to people to have audio-visual recording? In schizophrenia, also people and in clinical high-risk patients have trouble with face emotion recognition. So we're looking to see if face expression and face emotion recognition deficits might be related. This is a study that I had done before, showing a deficit in clinical high-risk patients who go on to develop psychosis. And then more broadly, how can these studies inform clinical trials, thinking about the neural mechanisms, and then building models, because these are complex data sets in terms of the time series, and then thinking about other disorders as well. And then these are all the people I've worked with. Jay, I don't know if you're on here. Are you on here, Jay? Ramina's on here. There's Barnaby. There's Ramina. There's Lena. Jay, can you send me a picture? I'll add it. I'm sorry. And there's people who've done the work. So thank you. I'll be glad to take any questions. Questions in the chat. Oh yeah. Oh, sorry.
I don't want to steal it, but I was looking at this time series of the emotional valence from face units, and
what's that? I can't hear you.
The time series of the like the joy over time, like copying. Are you?
Oh,
what are you looking at there? Are you looking for something like a minimum facial expression or correlation over time with the interviewer, or?
So yes, we're looking at the correlation over time. Let me, can I go back on my slide? Yeah. So this is Steve, the engineer I work with, who's been doing this. And he is very interested in the correlation between the individuals over time. So there's there are kind of two time frames for facial mimicry. There's like a very instant one, and people have studied that like, you know, just right away. But then there's also a sort of longer time frame that seems to be related more to the content of like what people are speaking about. And just to mention, this is something called Hume AI. So Cohen, this was in Nature in 2021. He came up with a way to label emotions, made it into Nature. So he was persuasive it was a good way to do it. And then we got the license and we've been looking at the different emotions. Did I answer your question? Yeah. No, we're very interested in the synchrony. Yes. Oh,
I was wondering if it would be possible to feed, not feed, but to put all of this data through machine learning and have facial recognition do the, not the inventory, but basically like making the machine learn what is, I don't know, like 2 standard deviation from
that's
normal
interesting.
facial.
Like what's the norm?
Yeah.
That's a great idea. You know, we've been taking it from the psychosis perspective, the disease perspective, where we have specific questions, right, that are informed by what we know about schizophrenia pathophysiology or what we might want to treat. But that's a really nice idea too. And you need a big normative data set. Yeah.
And something similar but different. Since we know that large language models are based on probabilities, could we like say that like the most probable word is in a way a mean, and then calculate how much the speech is, you know, again, the standard deviation, like 3 SDs difference of this speech compared to the norm, and then, you know, gain some data.
That's also an interesting idea. We've been a little more sort of mechanistic, but that kind of like, if I'm getting what you're saying, sort of like throw everything in and come up with a norm and then see how people deviate from that. It's a great idea. Lenny, you gonna run with this, you guys?
This is an approach that not just in speech and language and facial expression, but also any measurement we take, there is a question, what is a norm? And
what is
the norm?
What is the norm?
Yeah. And can we understand the deviation from the norm as the sign of pathology rather than quality as a sign of pathology? This is interesting thinking, but you need a lot of data, I guess. You need quite a lot of data from healthy people.
I think the thing with schizophrenia in particular is that to say someone is different, it's like, there are a million ways in which people with schizophrenia are different from the norm. So I wrestled with Guillermo, the people at IBM, though we've kind of won each other over time. They kept just wanting to do machine learning models and optimizing accuracy. And I'm like, I need to, that my client, you know, like I can't publish that. I mean, people do. I'm like, it's not interesting. I want to know what's in the box. So, but I mean, you could do that and then also look at the factors and things.
There's a Zoom question. Can you see that? Yeah, this is from Sunny Tang.
Oh, Sunny, hi, how are you? You're on my slide too.
Think about facial ecologically valid.
This is a great question. So it's well, you could all read it as well as me. So we actually the Brain Initiative had a RFA for small grants, planning grants to develop sort of approaches, strategies for looking at ecologically valid behavior. And so we really argued that dyadic conversation is ecologically valid, certainly in person, face to face. We had both, we'll see if it gets funded. We had both face to face and Zoom, with the idea that Zoom is like in person, but degraded in terms of the data that's available, and you have lags and things. I skipped over those slides, but there are issues for sure with Zoom. But we also argued that Zoom now is ecologically valid as well. I mean, you know, I can't see you, Sunny, but you know, so much of what we do is on Zoom. These are empirical questions that we'll answer hopefully in the grant. So the grant is just started, it's on face expression, and we'll have tests of social functioning. Did I answer your question, Sunny? Are there other questions? Sure. Hey, Jay. I can hear you. You project.
So thanks, Cheryl. It's great to see you, and
It's nice to see.
How the field has developed. And in particular, I do have a question here, but in particular, really need to see how a lot of this has emerged from the goal of understanding the inner experience, and along with kind of the output of patients, which I know
This is a great question.
So my question for you, Cheryl, is actually about some of what you presented. Again, on the comment you made about kind of open-ended interviews versus perhaps more structured. But I want to go back to some work you've done previously about stress, right? So you had a long kind of career in stress research. Many of us, Romina, someone else, who spent a lot of time working kind of with stress paradigms, but then a little bit as well. And
You have.
one of the critiques that shows up there is about how ecologically valid is stuff. So I wanted to see if there was something, kind of the way you think about it has drawn from your experience in stress research with respect to the open-ended interviews versus more structured. Like, how do you think about ecological validity in the context of that?
So, you know, it's the patients, the people we interview, patients, healthy controls. I mean, they're not just patients, right? They're individuals with symptoms. They love these interviews, so they don't find them stressful. I mean, people will ask if they can do more of them. People really like to talk about themselves. So I don't see it as stressful to them. And you know, the research coordinators I have are just really nice people who listen. And you know, it's not meant to be therapeutic, but to the extent that you know, you speak and someone actually pays attention and listens, it's not stressful for them. Am I getting at what you're asking?
Maybe I should clarify a little bit. I've never seen these as stressful in terms of the open-ended question. But there's been a critique of stress research in psychosis, for example, that a lot of the stress paradigms we use are not ecological.
Oh.
Whereas it strikes me that some of these open-ended interviews, so this is now less about stress, it's more about NLP research. These open-ended questions are actually perhaps a little bit more ecologically valid because in some cases they mimic clinical interaction or like clinical exposure, in addition to perhaps being more open-ended and not overly structured in sort of, you know, a very rigid Q&A background.
I mean, that's what we're really aiming for, is to have it be ecologically valid. And then, you know, so these are, I'm really interested in the dyad and how it, you know, unfolds, you know, without structure. But for studying these things, there are other paradigms that can be useful. So for instance, Steve Heisig, who's the guy I work with, who's at Sinai, who used to be at IBM, and he's an engineer, and he's doing all this cool stuff, works with Helen Mayberg, depression patients who've had deep brain stimulation, and they do daily diaries. And, you know, we've talked about this in AM schizophrenia. It didn't have good pickup in AM schizophrenia. I'm not sure why, but the people who there are a lot of patients who will do that. They'll every morning they'll open up their phone and they'll say what they think, like as a recording of the day. And is that ecologically valid? phones are part of our ecology now. And so, I mean, but I think that's really interesting about stress, but we strive for ecological validity. And then also I kind of glossed over it, but I didn't mean to. But the ethics of all of this is a whole other thing, and data use agreements, et cetera. I had to work very carefully with the IRB. I'm sure you've had to hear. I like my IRB chair. He's like, Cheryl, this like international audio and video going to Canada and Australia. He's like, can you like put pixels? I'm like, no, you can't put pixels and then analyze it. You have to actually see the face. And for those of you who are going to ACNP, we actually, I'm chairing a session on the ethics of all of this. So if you're there, I'll hope you'll come. We've brought ethicists and talking to them, because like I thought ethics is just like, privacy, confidentiality, like a researcher, right? And check my boxes for IRB. I want to be a good girl. But, it's also like who owns the data and what's done with the data and input from the community and what are the questions that are being asked. I mean, so should be a good discussion, but the ethics are also part of it. The Ecological Validity Brain Institute is, I don't know, it got a score in the 30s. So all my grants seem to be on the fence and then somehow fall in. I've been lucky lately, so hopefully that'll happen with this one. Did I answer your question? Oh, right behind.
I think where my question stemmed from was your comment about how you sometimes get, I don't know, like in trouble, but because of the open-ended style of
Well, with reviews, Yeah, I don't know. You have an open-ended section in discourse, right? But it's a little bit shorter, which is reasonable. It's more scalable, and Guillermo would say he doesn't need a whole lot. But you also have some structured ones too, right? What are you finding? Do you get different kinds of results? Yeah. Even with face expression, so I have colleagues, Josh Woolley, who has a data set of schizophrenia patients on and off oxytocin while they're watching videos of different emotions. I don't have that here. I mean, I could have added it, but they also have face action unit 7 deficits. Let me just say this quick. What's also cool about that is that with clinical ratings, when the schizophrenia patients are on oxytocin, by clinical ratings, their face expression is normal. But if you look at the face action units, it's not normalized, right? So that's kind of, an argument for doing that. But they also found, which is consistent with some other studies Guillermo did, that and we found this in this data too. I'd be curious what you all think about this. When people are speaking, people with schizophrenia, on average, when they speak, they have their face is more animated, but when they stop and listen, it's like their face collapses. I think I have that in one of the slides, and it's like it must be something about our data. But in the structured paradigm, where they had people watching and speaking, they found the same thing. This keeps popping up. So why? What's that about? That's interesting. Like, is it some kind of like cognitive reserve thing? Because in a way, listening in a conversation might be harder than speaking. Speaking, you're already talking. But when you're listening, you have to think, oh my God, what am I going to say? When am I going to say it? Do I intervene? You're listening, you're planning. I mean, I don't know. It's something that keeps popping up. I don't know what it is. Is it fun to study it and think about what it might be?
Maybe I can ask the last question. So my name is Rida Joubert. I'm a psychiatrist here at the Douglas Hospital. We are going to meet
Nice
this
to meet
afternoon.
you. You're a little bit muffled. I'm sorry. I'm old.
So I
My
will
hearing
speak
is-
louder. So I said, we are going to meet this afternoon, hopefully. My name is Rida Joubert. I'm a psychiatrist. So I think one of the things that we tend to overlook in the field of early intervention and psychosis and ultra high risk is how much these people have early developmental disorder. And one of the major ones that basically can, can confound a bit this field is language developmental disorder, whether it is expressive developmental disorder, receptive developmental disorder. We don't know what is the proportion of these people who have these developmental disorder, what are the implications of this. So are you taking into consideration this dimension of developmental disorder in this field?
I love this question. So for years, like I was interested, now I can't remember the actual language, I forget the acronym, but for sort of developmental language disorders, I always thought, has anybody followed them into adulthood? Are they at more risk for psychosis? Or, is there a subgroup of them who are at risk for psychosis? I was particularly interested because in psychosis and clinical high risk, and in clinical high risk as a predictor of psychosis, there's an EEG measure called mismatch negativity for auditory stimuli that it's like the most replicated biomarker in psychosis and clinical high risk. And in these kids with these developmental language disorders, they have the same auditory processing mismatch negativity findings. I would read about it and I'd be like, what happened to these kids? I actually sent some emails at the time, but the people who had published were no longer working, whatever. I always thought we should find these kids who have language disturbances early on and then follow them, The other thing we should really do is attention deficit disorder. I'm sorry, I'm getting on a whole other thing. So attention deficit disorder, right, is treated with stimulants, and then there are black box warnings because the stimulants could cause psychosis, et cetera. But then people with psychosis, because we would get records, clinical high risk, I'm sure you do as well, Jay. You get, records. They have attentional deficits, they have language impairments, et cetera. But the attentional deficits also is a precursor. So we should be following people with ADHD to see who develops psychosis and see if their attentional deficits are different in some way, right? And maybe the same.
We did some of this work, and basically 25% of the people who come to our program have.
I can't hear you. I'm so sorry.
Oh, sorry. We did some of this work, and we found that 25% of the people who come to our program have, to the program of early psychosis, have had the diagnosis of ADHD prior to their admission. So it's extremely high, and it has not been on the map. And I suspect that much more probably have the diagnosis of ADHD and other developmental disorders that are not at all on the map. And I think it's very important to know what would be basically the effects of these developmental disorder on, language processing and all these parameters that we are taking.
I'd love to hear more about your work. It sounds really great. I have gone over.
There's a lot of interest in the talk, but I would forget to thank everybody if I don't stop the questions now. So they're going to interact with you later today. So
Sure. And I'm glad. Thank you to the people who attended. There's more in the discussion, though.
I want to thank you, especially.
Oh, thanks.
Visionary, who suits you very well. I'll tell you why. Visionary is the person who actually not just sees something in the future, but also shows the way how to get there.
Oh, it's very nice.
At the time when we were very interested in language, we were all, talking to Simco and others how to do language work. But then you wake up and read the 2015 paper that you and you did what done. You suddenly see a way to what ends, and that was the start of.
Oh, but really, it's like chance favors the prepared. Like I could not say I had this idea. I'm like, let's use. I did it. My colleague was like, do you have some transcripts? I'm working with this guy. I think it was Jill Beatty, who's in Melbourne. I'm like, yeah, I don't know, sure. It's, if you were working with Jill, you would have published, you know what I mean? It's like, you just have to be, and you've done such beautiful work with Discourse. I'm sure everybody in here is in Discourse.
So, anyway, thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Lena. Oh, here.
Reminds me that the next topic
Oh, Emily.